Good evening, everyone. Glad you joined tonight's Salon, WGA Genre Committee's Salon conversations that we usually have with prominent writer-directors and writers at the WGA. And today we have Adam McKay. We are very excited he is here. Before we start, we would like to talk to you about some WGA Genre Committee events that are coming up very soon. I'm Dwayne Johnson Cochran, the chairman of the Genre Committee, and I introduce Kelly Jo Brick, who is vice chair.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I want to let you know about our next upcoming Genre Committee meeting. It's where we put together events like the one tonight. We'd love to have you come and join us as we celebrate all kinds of genres. Our next meeting is virtual. It's going to be Tuesday, April 5th at 6 p.m. and we'd love to have you. Just check the Guild calendar for it. And back to you, Dwayne.
Right, and we're going to have a guest for that event, and we will tell you who that is closer to the event. So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Genre Committee longtime member, illustrious John Allen Simon, who's going to do our moderation tonight for this salon. Thank you, John. Take it away.
Thank you, Dwayne. Thank you, Kelly Jo, and thanks to Netflix and Paula Woods PR. And to Adam's Stacy at Hyperobject Industries for helping us coordinate this and get it together. And you've got Adam's bio as a PDF, so I won't go into any of that detail. But what's not on it, although it does mention 17 Academy Award nominations and Academy Award winner for his adapted screenplay for The Big Short and Up Again for his original screenplay for Don't Look Up, is that he was also nominated for his screenplay for Vice by the WGA, and he is up again for a WGA nomination. And even though it's award season and he's been put to the test of doing these kinds of interviews and things, the WGA balloting is over. So he's doing this not from any venal motive, but purely out of the goodness of his heart to share some of his insights and experience as a writer with us. And, just to mention that, having started out as a head writer for Saturday Night Live and his comedies, of course, with Will Ferrell, particularly Anchorman and Talladega Nights and Step Brothers, he's now making movies that are funny, but also different. I mean, I think that one of the things you've said, Adam, is that comedy is in a weird place today, and that the kind of movies you made earlier in your career about entitled guys, white guys, puffed up with themselves, are, don't work anymore, that comedy has something different to say now. Wonder if you want to just start by maybe enlarging on that idea a little bit on the state of comedy today.
Yeah, so I come from a background, like you said, SNL, and first off, thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it.
Oh.
And I come from a background of SNL, but before that, I came from Chicago comedy scene that was predicated, I'm sure a lot of you know, on political comedy. There's a big labor movement in Chicago, a history of a labor movement. So I was lucky enough to cross paths with a bunch of teachers, first and foremost among them Del Close, who always taught that comedy should be connected to the world. And, other people like Steve Carell, Tina Fey, Steve Colbert, all came out of that same sort of tradition. And so, even when I was doing the stuff that I was doing at SNL as head writer and as a writer and eventually making short films, and then with Will too, with the movies we did, we always had some sort of idea underneath it, as ridiculous as it was. With a movie like Anchorman, clearly we were making fun of infotainment, sexism in the workplace, puffed up white guys, With Talladega Nights, we were sort of exploring that red state American pride that was really starting to get strong at that point. So there was always kind of this floor underneath us of a kind of common conversation that we were having. But I felt like after the 07, 08 financial collapse, and then into the failure of our government to punish anyone, income inequality is starting to spiral at a just tremendous rate, way past the Gilded Age even. And then eventually hitting the wall of Donald Trump becoming president, mixed all with this climate crisis that is something that just keeps getting worse and worse, and all of our projections get more and more pessimistic. And then you take all of that stuff and you mix it with the spoon of social media and 1,000 channels, and suddenly that common floor that we need for comedy was much harder to find, that common ground. And it's always fun to be challenged. And I definitely felt challenged at that moment with The Big Short, with Succession, with Vice. We started to look for ways, inspired by a lot of other great movies, to blend genres. Is there a new type of storytelling? Had we become too comfortable with certain rhythms of storytelling? And so at that point, my company and myself, we started setting out to mess with the usual genre boxes and Sid Field kind of 3-act structures that we've been used to.
Well, let's show a clip from Anchorman, which is still very funny. And in some ways, I think we'll talk about sort of its evolution into when we show a kind of a similar scene in a way, but similar but very different scene from Don't Look Up. Now I'm doing this, as I said, from my computer, these clips, and so bear with me, folks, if there's a little bit of if it's less than perfect, but I'm going to do my best. All right, well, that came off all right. Well, that's still very, very funny, Adam. And you did a sequel to the movie. You did an Anchorman 2, and then you made the transition to Big Short. Why don't you talk about that, for which you won an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay? Why don't you talk about how that came about, and also maybe a little bit about whether or not some of the lessons you learned from Del Close, who was your teacher, and of course is the subject of a really great documentary you're in called For Mad Men Only. I think it's a reference to Hesse's Steppenwolf. You've talked a little bit about the third idea, and tell us a little bit about your process in applying that to Big Short as opposed to something like Anchorman.
Yeah, so I think like Anchorman, and I haven't seen that sequence in years, but you can feel this kind of dopey innocence about it, that really we didn't know that we had this powerful tool, which is broadcast news, broadcast media at our disposal. So that was an era that I grew up in, where I grew up around Philadelphia. It was Jim Gardner and the Action News team, Don Tollefson, and they were like gods. I mean, whatever they said was true. I don't think they even knew it. And these guys would run these towns. And I've heard stories like this from all around the country of the news team in each town and how they would party and how they were like gods in that town. But, and as fun and as goofy as it is, it's almost like you could watch that and then put on Broadcast News by James L. Brooks, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. And that's what became of that. I mean, eventually, and I've talked to news producers about this, and they told me how they would have consultants, they called them the consultants, would come in. And guess what? You're the #2 news station. You got to do something. and it was all about the hair, and it was all about the colors, and it was all about the pizzazz, and lead with the crime, and put down the state voting stuff. And this same producer told me 20 years later, when all the news ratings had gone down, a lot of those same consultants went around and said, you got to get back to real news. And so, I think, the people that wrote the Constitution had no idea that the fourth estate, the press, could ever be this entertaining. And it's both hilarious, as hopefully some people think it is in Anchorman, and horribly dark and tragic, as you see in Vice, with the kind of frothing run up to the Iraq War. So yeah, I just look at all of it as, you were talking about third thought from Del Close, and that was something he talked about a lot when you're improvising on stage. By the way, there's a great documentary that's worth seeing called Trust Us, We Made This Up. And it's about two of the best improvisers, TJ Jagodowski, Dave Pasquesi, and they really get into what I'm about to talk about. But Del's thing was stay on stage until, go through your first thought, which is knee jerk, second thought, which is okay, and wait, even if you have to stand in silence on stage and wait for the third thought. Now, the trick to this was he didn't mean that you were writing August Osage County, which I love. He meant it for anything. He meant it for The Simpsons. He meant it for, Ren and Stimpy. He meant it for, he always said, if you're going to be dumb, be brilliantly dumb. And so that was kind of a method that you can see. Ian Roberts is in that clip, who's one of the greatest. He's the guy doing the countdown, one of the greatest improvisers ever. So that's always kind of been the way we've been working. What was new was just, I never expected, what's the George Packer book, the Unwinding? I just never thought civilization as we know it would start to unwind visibly in front of us. That was the surprise.
And in terms of, you have some background as a stand-up, and of course you worked in improvisation. And, do you think that informs your method as a writer in terms of how you work?
Yeah, I definitely do. I was speaking with a writer the other day who described my stuff as theatrical, that it engages the audience in a very active way, even when you're in the movie theater. And I think because I come from a background of having been a below average stand-up comic, having been an improviser, Second City, done some performing on SNL, comedy just necessitates this connection with the crowd and the moment that's really can really be amazing. I mean, if you look at some of the great stand-ups throughout history, like Richard Pryor and George Carlin, you can see they were really tapping into moments in a way that very few people were. So it can be a real strength. What I've been trying to find with the later stuff that I'm doing is, how can you, and this gets back to the genre part of it, how can you play with deeper emotions and yet at the same time laugh at the absurdity of life? One of the great movies to me, and it's a big inspiration, is Get Out. I thought Get Out did a great job of bending genre, playing around with being a thriller, a satire, a comedy. Another one I've spoken about a lot is 24-Hour Party People. And Kung Fu Hustle is another movie I love that has almost like 6 genres inside of it. And I really think after 100 years of watching movies, 120 years, if you count the elephant being electrocuted, 130 years of watching movies. By the way, that was a big hit in its day. I think audiences are we're developing, we're becoming used to different styles, bending genres, crossing lines, feeling different things, because no matter how much our economy and social media and advertising wants to tell us that every emotion is in a clean box, it's clearly not how it works for us.
I'm sure, having had such a run of successful comedies of that earlier type that you were engaged in writing and directing, that people wanted you to stick to your own play box. Big Short, I think one of the challenges, one of the things I so admire about it, the writing as well as the directing, is that you have this enormous amount of expository detail that you need to get across to the audience. I mean, I think I remember, I almost picked it as the clip to show, but I didn't. I remember really, really laughing very hard when I saw it for the first time at the Margot Robbie bathtub scene, where she's in a bubble bath drinking champagne and explains to us about subprime loans. Let's show a little clip from it. That's not the clip, so if you're waiting for it, it's too bad. But it's a little piece of the trailer, which I think shows kind of the range of what the movie's concerns are, which are quite serious, but you deal with in such kind of an engaging way to bring us along. So here's another clip. The detail that you go into, I think you were quoted as saying somewhere that some people find detail boring, but if you get into it enough, it engages people, it brings them along. And that one of the keys to making any kind of art is to respect the audience as potentially poets and geniuses that you're addressing. And I think that's what makes Big Short kind of so unique and so works so well. How hard was it to get it made and to get it on the screen, the way you want it, and to assemble, an amazing cast?
I got to give a lot of credit to Paramount. I mean, they paid me to write the adaptation. There was already a script out there from Charles Randolph that was really good. I like Charles' script a lot. And I just had these ideas, and I don't know if they were humoring me or not, but they let me do a draft and sort of looked at me like, look, if you can get this going, we're okay with it, but you got to get it going, which means you got to get cast. And so all credit to that cast. Christian Bale, Carell, obviously I knew. Gosling, I didn't know that well. Pitt, I didn't know that well. And they all just jumped in. They read the script and they're like, we're with you. I mean, I think that was an exciting moment for me because ultimately with my background, I think you could say I make populist movies. And I think the word populist has taken on a darker hue of late because we tend to think of
right-wing populism.
We tend to think of right-wing populism, anti-science, but we forget there's one of my other mentors is a great writer by the name of Thomas Frank. And he wrote a great book recently, which I highly recommend, called The People, No. And it's a history of populism. And I didn't know that there was a massive political movement in the late 19th century that was based around populism in a positive way, in a way that was for workers and speaking to the WGA. One of the reasons I love to talk to my guild is it's a guild, and that's important in this day and age. And so with The Big Short, there was a little bit of a breakthrough moment where I get to say the secrets. I get to actually say the stuff that some of the insiders know, with, in this case, the banking fraud. And I've done enough movies, I've done enough TV shows that I can give it some life, I can give it some play, but I got to give all credit to the audience in that case, because they were just with it and they lit up. And And it was a great reminder to me because, you know, we live in this kind of, to some degree, gaslight culture that is always telling us people don't want to hear the real information. They don't want to hear the real truth. They want the bright colors. They want the simple lines. And it's just not true. And so The Big Short for me was a major kind of wake up when it came to that. I went for it, but then the reaction really surprised me. Now, don't get me wrong. Everyone hates big banks, right wing, left wing. I mean, I think that was one of the engines of the movie The Big Short is everyone had been screwed over. My dad had lost his house. I knew tons of people that had lost work. We were all feeling a pain, even though it was a couple of years later. So as kind of a story to tell, I don't know if there's anything more populist you can do than the big banks own our government and are rigging the system. There's very few people that disagree with that. And then I got very lucky that I had these incredible actors who just, you know, blew these performances away, and an incredible DP, Barry Ackroyd, who shot the crap out of that movie.
And the movie is so well edited. I mean, it's brilliantly well edited. How much of that was in your script, or did you find that more in the editing room in post?
Well, that movie was the beginning of a partnership that, you know, I always joke has caused me quite a bit of good trouble, to quote John Lewis. And that was Hank Corwin. And Hank Corwin is a singular creative force. And I brought him in to cut this movie. And he started bringing in some of it in the script. I had stuff that was scripted. There were snippets of news, culture, but he took what I had and he pushed it 80% further. And I'll never forget that first day I went in the edit room, and he kept telling me, "You're going to want to fire me. You're going to," because I think he's gotten in trouble with some directors before. And I was like, "No, this is exactly what I've been looking for." It's no longer with storytelling. This is just my opinion. It's no longer three characters in a room. There's always a fourth character, which is this massive media cultural sort of machine is always in the room. And Hank was the first editor, and I've worked with some great editors, by the way. Brent White was amazing. But Hank was the first editor, and if you look at his filmography, going back to Natural Born Killers, Tree of Life, he's been hunting this the entire time. He's been hunting this kind of collective character that's in the room with us. So that was definitely a chocolate and peanut butter moment for me. Or if you didn't like the movie, you could say tuna fish and sriracha moment. I don't know.
I like tuna fish and sriracha.
Actually, that sounds kind of good. That was not a great example. Yeah, but no, that movie was also very big for me as a writer to get to collaborate with Hank Corwin. And I just was amazed to meet someone who was, you know, even with the movies like Anchorman and Talladega Nights, if you look at them, we're always trying to chase down this collective feeling, this kind of, Anchorman 2 actually does it more than any movie, even though it's a sequel. So of course, people don't like it as much, but the middle 40 minutes of that movie really puts its finger right on it. And so to meet Hank was a major moment. And then I also got to meet Nicholas Britell, the composer, who was another like-minded guy who turned out to be an ex-financial genius. He ran one of the biggest hedge funds on Wall Street, and he knew this whole world inside and out. So I had a composer who, like, I'm not exaggerating, he really is a financial genius. He could be making billions right now, but instead he's a composer. So that was kind of when our nucleus came together, mixed with Kevin Messick, our producer. It definitely a new kind of group came together on that.
And he's the composer for Succession too, isn't he?
He is. I mean, that was one of the first things I did when I read the pilot. Was I said three things. I was like, we should shoot it like it's King Lear. we should hire Nicholas Bertel and Brian Cox has to play Logan Roy. Those were the three things I told Jesse Armstrong, who was like, huh? And it was like, Jesse's the best. So eventually we got there. But yeah, Nicholas was important to Succession because he kind of got the joke. He got the joke that it was going to be a little too elevated. He's an amazing talent. No one like him.
Well, we'll get to Succession in a couple of minutes, but one of the things I wanted to ask you about Big Short was breaking the fourth wall with the characters to kind of comment to the audience. Obviously, the way you shot it, you knew you wanted to do it that way, but did you or any of your colleagues ever have any kind of doubts about it? It's kind of an audacious thing to do in a movie that already is taking on an awful lot.
You know, it's so funny because we just premiered our Lakers show, Winning Time. We break the fourth wall in that as well. And I constantly get that. People are like, oh my God, we broke the fourth wall. I'm like, it's like the oldest device. I mean, it's like literally.
Shakespeare did it, of course.
Shakespeare, Commedia dell'arte. Like there was a huge movement in the 60s, the storytelling theater with Paul Sills. We've just seen it so many times. So it's very odd when people really get thrown by it or don't like it to me, because to me, it's just part of your toolbox. It's just there's a lot of tools you have to tell stories, and you have to look at each story and know, feel what's like. We didn't break the fourth wall and Don't Look Up because you couldn't. You needed to stay in the emotional space of those two main characters, DiCaprio and Lawrence's characters. So each story to me kind of requires different storytelling. And maybe that's part of my theater background, but I was lucky enough to be in a town, Chicago, that has a rich theater tradition and amazing experimental theater. And I've just seen every, and friends of mine who are experimental, Phil Stoltanoff is a guy who's a big influence on me, big European avant-garde director. And Richard Maxwell, oh my God, Richard Maxwell is amazing. I saw Richard Maxwell do a whole show where it was a musical, but he had the characters hold up handheld recorders that would play the music, and then they would sing to it. And Richard Foreman, obviously, was big in New York. So, there's a big, deep chest of storytelling devices. And I think, as you've seen America kind of go through the great moderation, as economists call it, we have gotten kind of a little conservative in some ways. That doesn't mean that if you don't like breaking the fourth wall, please don't like it. But it is interesting how these kind of classical forms have almost become rules. Like I joked about before, the 3-act structure of Sid Field, don't break the fourth wall, don't use a narrator, like all these kind of very classical restrictive rules. So I always laugh when people talk about the breaking the fourth wall. I'm like, well, sometimes I think it works.
Oh, I think it works. It works great in The Big Short. And there's one moment that's really kind of unique, I think, where Ryan Gosling is in the bar and comments that this scene wouldn't have happened because he didn't go out with those guys for drinks, the guys who are sort of the schleppers of the banking, of the bond business, or the kind of derivatives. That was kind of unique too. I mean, in terms of the movie,
no, I gotta interrupt you.
Yeah,
you know where that came from? That came from him talking to the real character, who said, "I never would have gone out for drinks with those guys." And then I got on set with Ryan, and Ryan said, the real guy told me he'd never go out for drinks with these guys. And I go, say it. Let's do, once again, you're making film. I go, do a couple takes where you say it to camera. It just happened in the Lakers show that we're working with Devon Nixon, who is the son of Norm Nixon, who's a character in the show. And we have Norm Nixon getting a pedicure. And Norm Nixon said, I never got a pedicure. We put it in the show. Anyway, sorry to interrupt you, but I just thought it was funny that specific moment.
Well, it's a good segue because I was going to ask you about improvisation. We're running kind of a little long. You've said it's okay if we go a bit over. Great. Talk a little bit about improv, how you work with it, and you've said that you don't want things to be too perfect. You don't want them to feel too polished.
Yeah, I obviously with the comedies, the ones with Farrell, you let it fly. I mean, you're just always looking for something fresh. I mean, at the end of those days, I'll never forget the end of Step Brothers. I would go home and my mind was like tired because you're just always working it. With the stuff that's a little more based on reality, like The Big Short and Vice, there are parameters. You're dealing with real people's lives, you're dealing with legal stuff, you're dealing with a much more narrow corridor. However, by that time, as the writer, I know that corridor pretty well. And I know all the restrictions that we have, and I know the freedoms that we have. So in the case of Ryan Gosling saying to me, the real guy told me he would never be out for drinks with that. Of course you can do that. Like, say it to camera. But there's definitely a little bit more of a restriction to it. With Don't Look Up, it was completely fictional. So I opened up the improv a little bit more. But what I love about it, beyond the actual lines, which you do get great lines and moments, I love it, what it says to the actors. It just lets the actors know that they're collaborating with you. And they have a freedom once you start doing that. I mean, I always joke that the first couple takes are going to be as written. I always say we're fulfilling our legal obligation to the studio, and they all know that if they don't like a line or something's weird or they want to try something, they have the right to try it. And I would say in my entire time of doing this, I'm not going to say the word career because I think the word career is a little gross, but I'm with David Simon. I think it's the root of evil in our country. But I'll say in my entire time in doing this, the greatest improvised line, the greatest added line was Leo DiCaprio at the end of Don't Look Up. Came up to me before the scene and said, I just feel like I should say something about what we're losing. And I'm going to assume most people have seen the end dinner table scene. If you haven't, cover your ears. And he said the line, he said, wow, we really did have it all. And my script supervisor and I both like right away teared up. And I was like, do it, say it. And that's what you get out of that, as opposed to do it as written. What I got out of that is one of my favorite lines in any movie, show, play, anything I've ever done in my life came out of that, of Leo being very passionate and rigorous. And so, I mean, that's an extreme version. Most of the time you get a lot of kind of half and half, and you're trying stuff and maybe there's something there, but wow, all these years of working this way, for that one moment that an actor could come up to me and say, I'm going to try this line, it was all worth it for that one line.
I was going to ask you about that line. The thing is, we really did have everything, didn't we? I mean, when you think about it, it's so poignant, and it's such a tonal shift in the movie at the one of the ends. And I'm wondering about tone shifts, how you what you think about them. I know probably for the Will Ferrell comedies, you did testing with audiences, to try to find out what works, whether the laughs are coming, you're stepping on them or not. Is that correct that you had to do testing on them, and that you learn things from it?
I've always said, one of the reasons we have that crazy depending on your opinion, that crazy golden age of comedy that was the late 90s through the 2000s was the Avid. I mean, the Avid, really going from the Chem to the Avid,
Yeah.
and for anyone who's super young out there, it used to be that you had to literally take the film and cut it. And with the Avid, you can try anything instantly. And
Right.
it was perfect for comedy. And when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, I mean, I think we would get a good comedy like every 3 years, every 4 years. And all of a sudden in the, 80s a little bit, and then really the 90s and the 2000s, there were like every year, there were like 3 or 4 comedies that go sit with a crowd of 400 people, you're gonna laugh. So that's a big part of it. The tonal shifts you're talking about are it's different. I mean, we're definitely doing wide tonal shifts with the movies we're working on now. I mean, Vice got really dark, and then it would have an absurdist move, and there are some people that don't like it. I personally feel like that's the world we're living in right now. I feel that it is sometimes a Marx Brothers comedy, and other times it feels like the pawnbroker. I mean, depending on the day that you're having or what information you're being hit with. So, we're still playing with it. The big thing with Don't Look Up, we always knew that the whole progression of the movie was going to be the characters moving out of our sort of, slot machine, bells and whistles culture, and leaving the clicks and colors and bright lights and celebrity and career and ego. All of it was going to melt away at the end for that one real moment at the table. So the whole movie was built for that. You're sort of like leaving this, with all due respect to the people that work our culture, our garbage culture, behind, and you're ending up at a real state that we're throwing out there that maybe we've lost in some ways. So the movie was built around that tone shift. It was hard to do. It took a lot of editing, a lot of work with the music, but yeah, it was from day one, that was the intention.
And I think it caught a lot of people off guard. I was lucky enough to see what I think was the first public screening of it at the DGA on Thanksgiving Day. We went, and I knew nothing about it, really. And it's such a kind of a surprising film with echoes of Dr. Strangelove, of course, and Network. And I don't know if you've ever seen a very little seen Richard Lester movie called The Bed Sitting Room, which is an apocalypse comedy. It's have you seen it?
The Bed Sitting Room?
Yes, it's after the nuclear war, and Sir Ralph Richardson is mutating into a bed sitting room, and Peter Cook and Dudley Moore are riding around London, and the 34th cousin of the Queen is now the Queen. And it's pretty hilarious and pretty sad too at the same time. But
I'll definitely check that out.
It's if you can find it, it's worth checking out. Maybe better in my memory than it is today, as is often the case. But I want to get to Vice and Succession, and then go into I think we'll have to deal with them fairly quickly. But Vice, to me, I think you kind of put your politics on your sleeve in Vice in a way that you didn't with The Big Short. And there was a lot of reaction to it. Let's show a clip from it. This one may be a little more troublesome because I kind of screwed up. No, I think we can do it. Oh, sorry. Forgot to share the screen, that's all. Well, that's probably my favorite scene in the movie, because it encapsulates what I believe politically, for sure, about Cheney and the modern Republican Party, but obviously, and I assume you do too, since you wrote it, but not everyone does. And I wonder if you would talk about that in terms of why it's so funny, and how you came up with it, when you came up with it.
Yeah, so that was probably the most divisive. I mean, that was probably the most divisive moment in the movie. I think the movie overall was divisive in the sense of there was a lot of people like, why do we need to see this? Why are we rehashing this? Um, and you know, we got to remember 76% of Americans supported that war. This wasn't going after the big banks. This was a very different topic. You know, I have my problems with the Democrats as well. I'm pretty public about that. But the scene you just showed, I spent a year reading every single thing I could about Dick Cheney. We hired our own journalist who went and interviewed people in his life. And same with Donald Rumsfeld. I could find no ideological consistency to any of their decisions other than power. And, you know, I took a lot of crap for that. But then after that movie, Donald Trump came in, and I think, you know, the kimono was open. There's never been an ideology behind the right wing. They've always, I mean, maybe if you go back to Eisenhower, you can find one a little bit, but even Eisenhower, you know, rolled over a bit for McCarthy, the Dulles brothers. But from after Eisenhower, I would say Eisenhower's a good man. From that point on, it became a party that has just been driven by the interests of big money, and they've used extremism as a way to get that agenda across. My one regret with the movie is that I didn't show how the Republican Revolution also hit the left. And I wish I had shown Bill Clinton deregulating Wall Street, you know, increasing penalties for people for drug offenses, deregulating the media, because the Republican Revolution isn't just the right wing. It was all of America got hit with us, to the point where the rest of the world jokes about how we don't have a left wing in our country. We have an extreme right wing, and we have a right of center kind of corporatist party. So that scene where he laughs at ideology, oh my God, people were mad about that. But I stand by it to this day.
And I think that, you know, I'm sure in reading all of those biographies, I mean, Robert Caro's talked about in doing his Johnson biographies, which are great.
You know, Robert Caro was, I read everything by Robert Caro coming into this movie, Vice. He was a huge inspiration. I can't believe you just mentioned him. But anyway, keep going.
Well, I think, you know, he found a sympathy for Johnson later in his career that he surely didn't have in the first couple of books of the biography. And you know, you do show an empathy and a sympathy and a kind of humanity in Cheney along the way. Even in that scene, he has a certain kind of idealism that it's now being inculcated out of him. And I wonder if that was really how the dynamic of that was for you, because I'm sure that politically you had no sympathy whatsoever for Cheney going into this.
Yeah, so that a lot of the momentum, a lot of the reason I wanted to make this movie was because I don't believe monsters are born. I really don't. I am a believer that people are basically good. And if you think I'm saying something that's out of a greeting card, scientifically, when people are loving and loved, when they're productive and helpful, they do better. I mean, we are, scientifically speaking, good. And so I was curious how you could end up with this guy, this dead-eyed guy, who would just lie us into this murderous atrocity that killed, by some estimates, as much of 1 million people. And I knew that it wasn't just he was born that way. So the whole movie was an investigation of how this happened. And what I found was that it was his wife came from a very abusive household. And she was the star of the state of Wyoming, and she chose Dick Cheney. And I think that comes across in the movie, but that's that's really it. And I'm not saying his wife is evil. His wife was like living during a sexist time. She was in a rough household. And it was the combination of the two. And she said this, if you want to understand my husband, know one thing, he's a fly fisherman. That's an actual quote from her. And he has an eye for detail that very few people in DC have ever had. And that's why we show the fishing throughout, because there's a patience to him. He waits, he takes his losses. So I learned a lot about him, and some people mistook that as me excusing it. But if you look at the movie, all the crimes are detailed in great relief. It doesn't excuse any of the crimes, but I just really wanted to understand. There's a beautiful song by Sufjan Stevens. I think it's called John Wayne Gacy.
Yeah, it's great.
And it's a song about a guy who killed, what, 50 young boys? And by the end of the song, you're crying. And you realize he's able to respect the victims while at the same time acknowledging the trauma that created the murderer. And that was my attempt with this. It was a lot. I'm not saying I did it perfectly, but we went for it. We definitely went for it.
Well, we're going to go to Succession, which I suppose we could have had a whole seminar on, but let's show a clip from it. And I'll just ask you, a couple of fairly short questions and see if there's anything you want to say. Oops, I've got to, sorry here.
I'm very impressed that you're managing the clips. I would not be able to do this. Also, your ceiling fan is haunting. It looks like something. It looks like something out of a 1950s movie. Your lighting on it is perfect.
Great. I think I'm like out of, as it gets darker, I'm like out of a Blair Witch Project. Well, there's that famous, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, conversation between Hemingway and Fitzgerald, where Fitzgerald says the rich are different, and Hemingway says, yes, they have more money. But Succession, I think, makes Fitzgerald's point fairly well. It's a fairly brutal kind of examination. It kind of reminds me the toxic masculinity of it, of some of Neil LaBute's early films. I love Your Friends and Neighbors, and in the Company of Men. And in the Company of Men. We don't really have anyone to root for in this movie, or in a way we come to almost root for someone. Talk a little bit about how you decided to talk about the very wealthy and very powerful and privilege in this way. I know you were not the writer of it, Jesse Armstrong is, but you're coming to it and championing it and directing the pilot.
Yeah, and Jesse's incredible. He's so collaborative. We spoke about everything as we were putting it together in the tone. And what I gravitated to right away was that Jesse was trying to do a very hard thing, which is to show extreme wealth without glorifying it, to show the emotional toll of extreme wealth without the glitz and the excitement of it. So I love the script right away for that reason. And I talked to Jesse about a bunch of movies that I love, that I call them like the unwatchable masterpieces. And they're movies that are so great and so good, and they just get America so much, but they're very hard to watch. And one is Elephant by Gus Van Sant. I think it's a genius movie. I think it's a total masterpiece. Very hard to watch. Another one I would put on that list, and this is something that informed the way I did this show a lot, is Foxcatcher. I think Foxcatcher, if someone wanted to ask to explain what's happened to America, I would say watch Foxcatcher. That's what happened to America. I think it's a masterpiece. I think it's incredible. So we talked about it, and casting is such a big part with these pilots. And it's interesting how the casting harmonizes with the writing, because Jesse had it in the script that Kendall was the one guy you had a little bit of hope for. And maybe Shiv too, maybe Shiv, Sarah Snook's character. And so those two characters, like Brian was easy. Brian was, Kronos, he was eating the kids. We knew who that was. But when it came to Kendall and Shiv, they were the key to the whole thing. And we got lucky with Kieran. Kieran just like knocked it out of the park. Everyone else was incredible. But from the beginning, I just was like Jeremy Strong. Jeremy Strong, there's a wounded quality to Jeremy, but a driven quality to him. And he's also an actor's actor. And I think once we cast him, and we actually had him read a couple times.
He wanted to play Roman, I've been told, originally.
He was looking at Roman. I can't remember if that was my suggestion, my terrible suggestion, or he gravitated towards Roman. I can't remember what it was. But then when we realized, with Francine Maisler, our brilliant casting director, when we realized that he was Kendall, that was it. That was it. The whole show fit like a puzzle piece. And we realized there was a soul at stake. That's being a little overly dramatic, but you know what I mean. But yeah, in the end, the reason that I loved it and I continue to love it is that it's always about the emotional wages. And I've known, through the years living in New York, I've met some of the children of this great wealth, through friends at SNL, and man, there is a darkness to that. There is, and I'm not playing a sad fiddle for them when there are people out there who can't pay their rent or, can't pay for healthcare. I'm not doing that, but boy, there is an emptiness to it that I just thought Jesse's script really captured. And as the director and as someone who writes, it was a great opportunity to make sure we really kept that alive. And it was very important. And with Andrzej Perek, my DP, we looked at a bunch of different movies, but Foxcatcher was a touchstone. And I've told that director a million times, like, you made one of the great American movies.
That's Bennett Miller?
Yeah.
He's
Yeah, and I told
terrific.
Bennett, you made one of the great American movies. Just so happens America doesn't particularly want to watch it. America's not quite ready to watch that. But man, I love that movie.
Well, I would like to talk to you more about it. We're going to do a segue that I wouldn't like, a transition I wouldn't like in a movie, and go right into Don't Look Up, which, I'm just as eager to talk to you about. I got to share the screen. That's the part I keep forgetting. Well, there's so many scenes I like in the movie, but I thought that in a way, some of the concerns and some of the techniques from Anchorman, find their way into a scene like this. And I know that you had this project in development before the pandemic, and then the pandemic stalled it. And you thought about it in a more deep way to what was going on today. And I think, it's funny because on Succession, I know that you were doing a table read the night that Trump won the election, I'm told. And that, of course, this movie is so informed, not just about climate change, but about anti-rationalism and the superficiality of the media and the essential unwillingness of people to take things that are seriously. And of course, it's a comedy about that.
Yeah, I mean, here's the ultimate irony of the entire experience. So we made the movie. I've been learning over the past 4 or 5 years that the climate crisis isn't 50 years from now. It's not for our great grandkids. It's actually like, they just came out with a study that says in 8 years, half of our days will be once every 100-year heat events. That was just a model that came out of a very reputable group. So this is careening towards us. And we make this movie, and I'm like trying to find a way to talk about it. But then, then I have to go on the press circuit, or I have to go online or do all this stuff. And I in some ways face plant just as bad as Jen Lawrence does. Like that when I say what I just said to you about the climate modeling, about by 2030, half of our days will be once every 100-year heat events. People are like, that's preachy, or that's your issue, or that's your issue, but it's not. Or then some people were like, oh, so if we don't like the movie, that means we don't care about climate. Like, no, that's not what I'm saying. So the experience of releasing the movie felt a lot like the movie. And it's been one of the strangest, heartening in a lot of ways to see people all around the world respond to it, and especially scientists, but also terrifying, demoralizing. Yeah, I never ever experienced anything like this one. I mean, and the fact that in the middle of making it, a pandemic hit, which, by the way, we don't entirely know. A lot of climate scientists have predicted years ago that there'd be an increase in pandemics with heat changing and animals moving into different zones. We don't know the answer, so that's not, it's neither here nor there. But yeah, it's funny. I was watching the scene and I was laughing, and I also felt sick to my stomach, because just day in, day out, you see it happen. And then after the movie came out, people were posting clips of morning talk shows and news shows doing exactly that to scientists. There's like a dozen of them out there. So very strange. Yeah, I mean, it's a big absurdist comedy, but then obviously it's got some real emotions running through it. And the response was fiery. It was fiery for the people that loved it, were passionate. For the people that hated it, they were passionate, which is great. But man, I was going to say I could do a whole thing about my press experience of releasing the movie, but then I just realized with my wife, myself, and about 9 friends would find it interesting. We did do a podcast about the making of the movie. It's called The Last Movie Ever Made. It's pretty good, and it's out there. But overall, man, oh man, like you said, when Trump won the day before our first tech scout on Succession, we're making this movie, a pandemic hits. It makes it awfully hard to do comedy and satire and stories about an unwinding society, to quote George Packer. Makes it really hard because it's happening faster and faster. And it's like, how absurd do we have to think to get ahead of this curve? Crazy.
Well, you seem to have kind of a hotline to the zeitgeist in terms of your last few projects. I think that I think Don't Look Up is the second most watched movie of all time on Netflix, and the first most watched in 87 countries, which must be very heartening. My impression was it wasn't very well received right at the very beginning. It kind of turned around, which in a way that I haven't really seen happen with a movie. Am I right? Or
no, you're exactly right. It was a really interesting release where there was a group of the critics that hated it on a level that I have never seen before. And we were truly astounded because, we screen these movies and you can tell when something's playing or not. And their reaction was, regular people won't like this, you're talking down. And I was like, wow, we never got that before. So we kind of thought, well, that's it. Maybe we missed something. But then the second Netflix hit that button and it went worldwide, this wave of people saying, yes, that's how it feels for me as well, came in. And we were #1 in countries like Pakistan and Nigeria. And with comedy, it's very hard to cross national lines and cultural lines. And it was just like Brazil embraced it in a crazy way. Zelensky was talking about it a couple weeks ago. It's like huge in the Ukraine. And it was like, insane. And they just told me they're doing a Just Look Up Day in March. Oh, we're now in March, in a couple weeks, in France, in like 50 cities, and it's starting to spread internationally. And then best of all were just the responses from the climate scientists, the epidemiologists, scientists from other disciplines, who were just like, that has been the last 25 years of my life. So it was like a very bumpy roller coaster release. But looking back on it all, of course it would be. I mean, look at the times we're living in. Of course, no one knows the exact lens to put on the time we're living through. So of course, there would be people that would vehemently disagree with this lens. And of course, there would be people that emotionally would really respond to it. So now that I've had a little bit of distance, I honestly, couldn't be happier with the way it landed. And especially that worldwide response was just really like beyond, forget success, failure, film, all that kind of stuff. It was really heartening for everyone involved in the movie to see that there were millions of other people out there that were feeling the same thing. So holy moly, it was crazy. By the way, when the movie released, I had COVID. I had gone over to Ireland.
Oh my God.
And I got Omicron after all my crazy, careful years of like mask and everything. The Omicron just chewed through it. So I was isolated in a room. My family was in the house, and I was by myself in a room with Omicron, feeling those body aches. I'm obviously okay, while this crazy release is happening. And then there's arguments online between critics and scientists, and it's getting heated. And it was, wow.
Well, the movie really landed for me. I was delighted by it, and I'm glad that it's really found an audience on. I know studios, traditional studios wanted to do it, but you could never have had the impact with a traditional release as you're having on Netflix with it. And I'm very aware that you've been very generous with your time, and I've been very greedy, keeping you a lot later than you expected. So Adam, if there's anything else you'd like to say, please do. But if not, just our thanks.
Honest to God, such a pleasure talking with you. I enjoy our conversations a lot. And thank you to everyone that tuned in, that jumped into this conversation, and Writers Guild strong.